everybody. I'm Famke Krumpmüller and I lead the EY Geostrategy team in Europe. I'm very happy to welcome you on another episode of Geostrategy in Action. And today I'm joined by Natalie Jaresko, and we're going to talk about Ukraine. I'm very happy for you to join me on this because we want to talk about Ukraine, and you've got super relevant background to speak about this. You have an MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. You spent 25 years in Ukraine. Part of that, you worked as the finance minister of the country between 2014 and 2016. In the context of that, you worked on the restructuring of the sovereign debt, and more broadly, you've got loads of experience in large-scale government transformation. So I'm very excited to be able to ask you a couple of questions today about Ukraine, where you see it's going and how you view the country's recovery. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for the invitation.
Let's start first with what we're seeing right now in terms of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And essentially, since the beginning of this year, we heard a lot of talk about ending the war in Ukraine. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the prospect of actually ending this war, especially in the shorter term. Do you think what need to happen for that, for that to be realistic? What are your thoughts on this?
I think that everyone has exhibited a desire to end the war. The challenge is on what conditions and under what situation. And there is a great divide between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has agreed to an unconditional ceasefire this year, but Russia has said they want to work out all the issues first. There have been several rounds of peace talks, and I think that will continue. However, the issues appear not to be at all similar on the table on the agenda from either side. In the case of Ukraine, Ukraine is looking for justice, accountability, meaning the return of children, the return of POWs. And in the case of Russia, they're looking for Ukraine, in essence, to give up sovereignty, to demilitarize, to give up any hope of NATO, to enable Russia to have a say in politics. And so that giving up of sovereignty as a concept is unacceptable to the Ukrainian people. And so there's been no change in those positions. And I believe that what you're going to see is because Russia has expressed recently that they believe that they are making progress on the battlefield, that they will not at this point agree to peace or a ceasefire. The challenge is that Russia is not actually winning on the battlefield, and I think that's something that many have pointed out as well. And so, if they controlled some 18% of territory at the end of 2023, they now control 19% of territory. So they're not making massive incursions into the country. It's a few square miles a day. And what Ukraine takes from that is that more leverage needs to be put on the Russian leadership to come to the table. And that pressure is both diplomatic pressure, sanctions and economic pressure, as well as battlefield pressure. And therefore, it's asking for more sanctions. EU just issued not long ago the 18th round of sanctions. It is asking for the introduction of secondary sanctions, and it is asking for a supply of weapons, even if they have to be purchased and not donated. And in the weapons side, air defense is number one. And then after that, of course, there's a whole list. So I think that we're going to continue to see fighting, unfortunately. And even if a ceasefire was put in place, it would likely be temporary.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. So I think you emphasize what I think is very important these days to understand because there has been so much talk and I guess also hope for an end to this war. But when we look at the progress that has been achieved over the past couple of months, nothing much has changed, right? And looking forward, as you say, as long as there is no change in position, then it will be difficult. I just quickly want to share also the scenarios that we run with on on this war in Ukraine, and they pretty much also reflect what you just said. And we see four plausible scenarios over the period from 2025 to 2028, and essentially going from the one that would be the most positive and have would be the least disruptive for global business towards the most disruptive one. We see as a first scenario what we call security for territory settlement. So this would essentially mean there is a peace deal that would most likely involve Ukrainian territorial concessions. And then it would also necessarily mean that there is an agreement on the so-called security guarantees from the West, EU, US, NATO, whoever ends up doing this. You can already see from everything that I said that this is currently the least likely scenario. It is also the only one in which actually some sanctions get lifted on both sides. And I think this is important to keep in mind that this is the least likely scenario, and that this is also the only one where sanctions get lifted from both sides. And maybe a useful reminder, in 2014, the Minsk Agreement, there was an agreement, and only gradually some sanctions got lifted. A lot of the sanctions were still in place years and years later when this next invasion happened at the beginning of 2022. So that's the first scenario that we see. The second one is one that of a frozen conflict. So essentially, there are talks. They might result in a ceasefire or ceasefires, but ceasefire that remains fragile. And in this context, it also remains very difficult to agree credible security guarantees, meaning that it is essentially a frozen conflict that continues. Looking at it from today's perspective, that's a continuation of the status quo to a certain extent, and therefore also a continuation of existing sanctions, possibly the increase of, as you just said, the EU also just agreed another round of sanctions. Then we have a third scenario, which is relatively similar to the second one, frozen conflict on the ground, but this is a scenario in which essentially Russia and the US agree terms that Ukraine and the EU don't agree to. And so this is where we then see a transatlantic disagreement. This is a scenario where there might be some sanctions that get lifted from the US side, but certainly not from the EU side. And as I said, unfortunately, on the ground, a similar situation. And then finally, there's the escalatory scenario, which would involve escalation from Russia's side. And that could potentially have broader implications for the region. But so when I conclude around what you said, and when I look at these scenarios, I think clearly, currently, from today's perspective and over the next couple of months or maybe year or so, unless somebody changes position, a lasting peace deal is not something that we think is likely. And maybe also important to understand that even if there is ceasefires, that doesn't equal that sanctions are being lifted on all sides immediately. So I think from a business perspective, important to prepare for the continuation of the conflict. And continue to scenario plan, and from there deviate what the potential probabilities are over different time frames.
Absolutely.
So maybe accepting this unfortunate kind of analysis that an end to the war does not seem very close, let's talk about something that is maybe a little bit more positive, is the prospects of recovery or reconstruction. And here, obviously, foreign investment in the private sector can play an important role. So you just attended the Recovery Conference in Rome. Maybe you can share a little bit what you heard and what the central themes there were.
Absolutely. It is a recovery conference because it has dimensions that are not just rebuilding. So the conference focused on four different concepts, four different dimensions. One is business, because this cannot be rebuilt without the private sector. The private sector is an integral part of any future. And if you think about the fact that as of February of this year, the World Bank estimated $500 billion in demand for reconstruction and recovery, and that only unfortunately continues, that role for the private sector only increases in its importance going forward. The second is the human dimension, because labor skills, movement of labor, having a labor force that's ready is incredibly important. But we also have massive mental health issues that have to be dealt with. We have the return of some 10 million refugees no one can estimate exactly who will return and when, but we know what's required for them to return: housing, economic opportunity, schools. And then we have the human issue of the internally displaced, approximately 5 million people who, what if they're going to stay in Ukraine, they need housing and jobs and schools for their children. So the second dimension was human. The third was about decentralization, ensuring that this doesn't happen in a top down manner, that local communities are engaged, not only in Ukraine, but in all of the partner countries. So Germany has been very focused on community partnerships. In fact, the federal government in Germany funds some of those partnerships. And those partnerships have resulted in quite interesting support, from ambulances to construction contracts and more. And then lastly, fourth, Ukraine's recovery requires reform. So the fourth dimension is reform. And that reform includes the measures that they need to take, that Ukraine needs to take for EU accession. So reform broadly, but reform specifically as well with regard to EU accession. Ukraine has just recently closed several of the clusters from a screening perspective. It awaits the opening of the first cluster to negotiate, actually, and it is very focused on moving that process forward, as are many European countries. So, four dimensions. I would say one, this conference was massively attended. These conferences occur once a year. I've never seen one that counted over 7,000, almost 8,000 attendees, and that's because of the private sector engagement. Um, and second, there was a new element to the business side, and that was defense tech, dual use technology. Um, Ukraine excels at drones, AI, electronic warfare. It's expanded its own defense production capabilities from 3 billion in 2022 to 35 billion this year. 700 manufacturers, more than half are private. And the opportunity, as Europe begins to look at its own security landscape of cooperation, is incredibly valuable. So you're seeing a lot more venture capital money. You're seeing a lot more technology investment.
Right. I think you point to something which is very interesting from also from the European perspective is the fact that tying Ukraine closer to Europe brings opportunities for both sides. And I think that's how it's currently being viewed by the actors. And of course, you speak about EU accession, and that is something that might be an ultimate goal, probably relatively long out, but that doesn't mean that in the meantime there is no movement towards further collaboration on many, many issues. And you mentioned defense, but then there's also energy interconnectors, freedom of movement of people.
Metals and mining, IT services, defense manufacturing, construction, energy, automotive industry, green energy. Believe it or not, they've been building solar for the whole period of the war, the full scale war. So, yeah, there is a lot of opportunity in a wide variety of sectors. And frankly speaking, business doesn't not have to wait. Every one of the partner governments, whether they be in Europe, Australia, or the United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, have been developing tools for the private sector to use now. So everything from export credit guarantees to financing lines, both debt and equity. So, for example, the French government has put in place a line of funding for small and medium sized French businesses to invest in Ukraine. And it's a grant that they can use as equity. And every country has been preparing, AFW in Germany, political risk insurance, war risk insurance. And most recently in Rome, they announced a European investment fund, which has gotten some 250 million euro. And it's going to act, my understanding, as a private equity fund, potentially part of it as a fund of funds. So I think the expectation is not that business will sit back and wait till this is quote unquote over and peace exists, but that they will prepare now and engage now to the extent reasonably possible.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and I think that is exactly the important thing. That's to understand that recovery is something that is actually ongoing. Can I ask you, and this might sound to some like a funny question to ask in times of war, let's say, but how would you describe the business environment in Ukraine right now? I mean, you just mentioned a couple of sectors in which that have been actually quite active over the past year or so. How would you describe it, and maybe what is the Ukrainian government also doing in that space? I'm sure you're aware of it.
Yes, the Ukrainian government is very focused on supporting both foreign and domestic investors, and so they've provided again credit lines, 579 interest rate for entrepreneurs and small businesses. They have a nanny law, which for foreign investors, if they wish to invest a certain minimum amount, they will walk the investor through the process, assign a particular individual to work through any and all, whether they be municipal, local government, or central government challenges, whether they be bureaucratic or other. I think that a new government has just come into place in Ukraine, and that government is ever more focused on the business community, both domestic and foreign. I think it's important to note that, unlike in other war situations, the Ukrainian government is fully functioning. It's delivering public services, whether that be garbage pickup, postal delivery, or hospitals, schools with bunkers, of course. But the government continues to function, and so the focus on you know job creation, skills, and tax collection continues to be critically important. As Ukraine adopts legislation aligned with the EU, as it moves to regulatory environments aligned with the EU, each one of those steps, even prior to actual accession, makes Ukraine's business environment more similar to the EU, which maybe um, is not an it's not it can be overregulated at times. There are different issues, but it will be understandable. It will be continuity, and it will be something that has been functioning over time. So I think with every day the environment gets better, with the exception, of course, of the risk that Russia is attacking civilian infrastructure, whether that be electricity, hydroelectric dams, or apartment buildings, and they're doing it across the country. I think it's important to note that this isn't a war that's only on the front line. And so businesses can look at the level of risk in their sector and in whatever geography they'd like to see. There is a special National Security Council provided with global insurance companies map, and you can look at it in any shape that you'd like. You can cut to agriculture sector, or you can cut to the west of the country to see what the risk is and what the experience has been. So I think Ukraine is open for business. I think there's still an enormous amount of improvement in the rule of law that needs to happen. But I do believe that at this time it just improves each day. Maybe not as fast as some would like, but it's improving.
Yeah, and thank you, Natalie, for highlighting this, which is maybe something that is extraordinary to a certain extent, right? This combination of an ongoing war with, as you say, from time to time escalations, etc., but at the same time, country that is trying to be open for business.
The greatest level of support in terms of the number of euros, for example, has been in during the course of the war. The EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank, and now the Council of Europe Development Bank, the World Bank, and IFC. And those monies are being provided for infrastructure reconstruction, electricity reconstruction, and of course, they're bid out to private companies. And so there's been about a $9 billion investment each year of the full scale war. And that's why, again, private sector can't ignore it, because there's a substantial amount of money going in.
Yeah, and obviously these institutions are trying to create an environment that attracts
Exactly.
private money as well. So very interesting. I'm sure we could continue for some time, but I do want to wrap it up to keep it nice and short and compact. Maybe to conclude, I don't know if you want to point to the most important things that businesses should look out to right now.
I think that businesses should lay the groundwork for the future of their business, scenario planning being critical. Identify the opportunities today and prepare for tomorrow and the day after. This is a complex market, not just because of war, but because it's an emerging market, which means it's generally higher risk. And I think that in this environment, getting to know that market, getting to know who the players are, getting to know what the competition looks like, and not just waiting is probably critical, because first movers matter in this case. And so you have a great deal of Polish interest, Turkish interest, German interest, French, and I think everyone has their own sectoral priorities and perspectives, but there is an ongoing need to prepare, to do the scenario planning, to lay the groundwork.
Thank you, Natalie. I mean, essentially what you're saying, and now obviously I need to say this, is what we would call implement a geostrategy. So essentially prepare the business to be constantly aware of the changing international environment, the changing environment in Ukraine, of course, but also in the relationship with Russia and the US and other important actors in this, and then think through how can this impact the business environment, therefore your business and what you're trying to do. Um, but so I think that's a nice conclusion. Thank you, Natalie, for your time. And I'm sure we will speak soon again.
I hope so. Thank you.